Good morning, guys. So where is Mr. T today? Actually, I'm out in front of where we live in New Orleans. It's called the Unione Italiana. It's the Italian Union Hall. And I want to tell you a little bit about the importance of the Italian immigrants in the founding and the prospering of New Orleans. In the period from 1884 to 1924, about 300,000. That's 3 with 5 zeros in the thousand family. Italians came to New Orleans. Most of them came from Sicily. In fact, they came from Palermo, Sicily, the capital of Sicily. And so many of them settled here in the lower French Quarter that it came to be known as Little Palermo. What happened was, in the middle of the 1860s, there was a civil war in Italy. And as a result of the decline of the landed gentry, the people who owned all the big plantations and farms, many of the serfs or peasants were freed up. And they had no place to go. They had very little economic prospects in Italy. And so they began to look for other places to go and seek their dreams and better jobs. And it happened at the same time that the Louisiana agriculture industry, strawberries, sugarcane, were in need of laborers as well, because at the end of the Civil War, slavery was over and the slaves who had worked the plantations were no longer available. So landowners in Louisiana were looking for new workers, and Sicilians and Southern Italians were looking for jobs. And so it was kind of a match that seemed to make sense to everybody. Steamship lines jumped on that, and don't you know, in a very short period of time, there were 3 ships every month sailing from Palermo to New Orleans. That was in 1881. And the cost was $40 a trip, one way. Many of the Sicilians came to New Orleans and, as I said, established themselves in the French Quarter. They worked on the docks, unloading the big steamboats, and they worked in agriculture. One town on the eastern side of Sicily named Cefalù sent many Sicilians to New Orleans. And it was the people of Cefalù who founded the Unione Italiana Social Hall for their social activities like weddings and parties and dances, and a place for them to congregate as Sicilians and live their culture. You can see the building behind me. Now, it didn't really look like that until early in the 20th century. What it looked like was the building next door. And I'll post some pictures of that house. That house was built in 1847, and there was one just like it next door. The Sicilians from Cefalù took over that house, and over many years added to it and expanded it into the building that you see there today. And then in the 1970s, it was turned into condominiums, and Mr. T and Mrs. Theriault were really lucky in 2003 to buy one of those condominiums, and that's where we live when we come to New Orleans. One of the things that the Italians in New Orleans still celebrate, and there's a lot of restaurants, and their cuisine is wonderful, and they've been able to combine ingredients of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico seafood to make some fantastic food. Every year, the Italians celebrate St. Joseph's Day. St. Joseph is one of the, he was in the Christian faith. He was the father of Jesus Christ. And St. Joseph's Day is a big day for the Italian Americans. They have a huge parade. Many of the families build what they call St. Joseph's altars. They pile up all kinds of wonderful Italian foods and cakes and breads and olive oil and wine. And they invite people from all over their neighborhoods just to come in and have as much as they want. So it's a wonderful time, St. Joseph's Day and the altars. Mr. T and Mrs. Theriault have been to several of them. They're great fun, lovely time to visit. Many famous Italian Americans, Sicilian Americans, lived here in New Orleans. And it just so happens that some of them were really important in the music industry. One of them was Louis Prima. And Louis Prima turns out was a cousin to Mrs. Theriault. And he was a famous trumpet player, and he had a band called the Wildest, and they played in the 1950s in New York and Las Vegas, and they were really famous for the kind of music and sound that they had. Another Sicilian American who was famous and really important for my generation and your grandfather and grandmother's generation was Cosimo Matassa. Cosimo Matassa had a recording studio, a small recording studio just down the street from here. And he had a brilliant musical ear for rock and roll. It wasn't even known as rock and roll at the time, but he recorded and was the producer for some of the most famous rock and roll talents, Fats Domino, Little Richard, and people like that. And Dave Bartholomew worked for him, and with him, he was an arranger of songs and a trumpet player and a sax player, and fantastic. So you might ask your moms and dads about that, and you can research Italian Americans or Italians in New Orleans on Wikipedia and other places. I've seen a lot of interesting information. So, as I always will, I'll post some still pictures with some captions, and you guys can learn as much as you want to know about the Sicilian Americans in New Orleans. And remember, Mrs. Terrio is a relative of them all. Mr. T.